The auction hammer hovered midair when a man who steps into other people's trouble walked forward and laid his money down. So why did he choose her moment to speak? The gavel trembled in the auctioneer's hand as Clara Reed stood with a worn tax notice pressed tight in her fingers. The crowd shifting her jaw enough to remind her she was alone in it. Boots scraped. Someone let out a quiet breath that sounded too close to laughter. Then a heavy step cut through the circle. Slow, certain. The tall cowboy didn't look at her when he set the money down. Didn't look at anyone. "She keeps the land," he said, like it was already decided. Clara didn't thank him. She didn't move toward him either. She just folded the paper, turned away, and left, because whatever he'd just done didn't feel like a gift. If you were standing there, would you follow the man who spoke, or walk away from him? The dust sat low over Dustfall Creek that morning, hanging in the air like it had nowhere better to be. Boots scraped against packed earth. Horses shifted in their lines, leather creaking soft and steady. Somewhere behind the crowd, a tin cup hit the edge of a barrel and rolled once before going quiet. Clara Reed stood at the back. She kept both hands around a folded paper, edges worn thin where her fingers had pressed it too many times. The ink had bled just a little from sweat. A tax notice. A date already passed. No one turned to look at her. Not really. Their eyes moved past her, landing instead on the name written on the board near the auctioneer's stand. Her land. The only thing about her that seemed to carry any weight in that place. "Next!" the auctioneer called, voice flat from repeating the same word all morning. Clara felt it before she heard it. Her name. A small shift in the crowd. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to let her know she'd been noticed now, for the wrong reason. A few men near the front leaned closer to each other. A short breath of laughter slipped out, then stopped like it hadn't meant to stay. Clara didn't move. She kept her eyes on the wooden platform, on the hammer resting there, on the hand that would pick it up. A little to the side, away from the line of buyers, a man stood with his shoulder against a support post, tall enough that the beam above him looked lower than it was. Hat pulled down, arms loose at his sides. Gideon Hale. No one stood near him. Not by accident. He didn't watch the crowd, didn't study the board, just stood there, like he'd been placed and forgotten. The auctioneer lifted the hammer. "Parcel on the East Ridge," he said. "Unpaid taxes. Bidding starts." The number barely left his mouth. Bootsteps cut through the open space. Not fast, not loud, just certain. Gideon pushed off the post and walked forward. The sound of it changed things. People shifted, not stepping back exactly, but giving him the kind of room that wasn't offered so much as taken. He didn't look left. Didn't look right. Clara watched him without meaning to. He stepped up to the table and set a folded stack of bills down, not counted out one by one, just placed there, like the amount had already been decided somewhere else. The auctioneer paused. His hand hovered above the hammer. Gideon spoke, voice low, steady. "She keeps the land." That was all. No explanation. No glance toward Clara. No waiting to see if anyone would argue. For a second, nothing moved. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat, slow, like he needed the time to think of a reason this made sense. "Well," he said, tapping the money with 2 fingers, "that settles the tax." The hammer never came down. The sound people had been waiting for simply didn't happen. A man near the front let out a breath through his nose. Someone else shifted their weight, boots grinding small stones into the dirt. Gideon didn't stay. He turned as soon as the words were said and walked back the way he came, passing through the same space the crowd made for him without asking. He didn't look at Clara. Not once. The dust settled again behind him. Clara stood there a moment longer. The paper in her hands felt lighter now, though she hadn't opened it. She looked down at it anyway, at the ink that still said what it said. Nothing on that page had changed. Around her, the auction moved on. Another name, another piece of land, another hammer lifting. Like nothing had happened. Clara folded the paper once more, slower this time, tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat. She didn't go toward the front, didn't follow the man who had just spoken for her like he had a right to. She turned instead, stepping away from the crowd, boots pressing quiet tracks into the edge of the yard, past the hitching posts, past a wagon with one broken wheel propped up on a crate. No one stopped her. No one called her name. Behind her, the auctioneer's voice rose again, steady as ever. Clara didn't look back. The wind picked up just enough to move a thin line of dust across the road ahead of her. She walked through it without slowing, shoulders squared, one hand brushing once against the pocket where the paper rested. Not saved, not free, just owing. And she knew exactly who that debt belonged to. The road out of Dustfall Creek ran dry and uneven, cut with wagon ruts that held last week's rain like shallow mirrors. Clara walked it without hurry, boots finding the firm spots by habit. The town noise faded behind her. Hammer strikes, low voices, the restless shuffle of hooves, until it was only wind and the distant creak of a loose fence somewhere out past the ridge. Her land sat where the valley thinned out, a narrow stretch, more stubborn than rich. The gate leaned inward, one hinge loose. She lifted it just enough to step through, letting it fall back with a dull knock. Nothing had changed. The fence line sagged in long, tired arcs. The well stood quiet, rope slack against the post. The small shed near the corral had a door that never closed right, one corner dragging the ground when it swung. Clara set her hat on the peg by the door and rolled her sleeves up without thinking. She didn't take off her coat. The air still held a bite in the shade. She walked the fence first. Wire hung loose between two posts that had shifted in the dirt. She pulled at it, testing. The wood groaned, but didn't give. She tied it off tighter with what she had left of an old coil, fingers working steady even when the wire bit into her palm. No one came down that road, no wagon, no rider. That was the way of it. Folks didn't come out this far unless there was something to take. By the time the sun dipped low, her hands were stiff and her shoulders ached in a way that didn't surprise her. She stood by the well a long minute, looking at the dark circle below, then turned away. There was nothing in it. She went inside and lit the small oil lamp on the table. The flame wavered once before settling. A tin cup sat upside down beside it. She turned it over, ran a finger along the rim, then set it back down. No coffee tonight. Clara sat, elbows on her knees, staring at the floorboards. Not saved. Not free. Just owing. She stayed there until the lamp burned low. The next morning came sharp and bright. Clara stepped outside with a bucket in hand, though she knew it would come up dry. She lowered it anyway, listening to the hollow scrape of wood against stone. Halfway down, the rope caught. She frowned and pulled it back up. The bucket came with it, heavier than it should have been. Water. Not much. Just enough to settle at the bottom and reflect the sky in a thin, trembling line. Clara set it down slow. She hadn't heard anyone ride in. No tracks marked the yard fresh enough to speak of. The ground held only her own prints from yesterday, half blurred by wind. She looked toward the fence line. Two posts that had leaned were standing straight now. The wire between them pulled tight. Clara walked over, slow, like she expected the ground to answer her. She ran her fingers along the knot at the post. It was clean. Firm. not the kind she'd tied the day before. A few feet away, near the corner, a small burlap sack rested against the base of the fence. She crouched and opened it. Nails, a handful of short ones, a few longer spikes, a length of new wire, coiled neat. No note. Clara closed the sack and sat back on her heels. The wind moved through the grass in low waves, brushing past her skirt. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried once, then again. She stood and looked toward the ridge. Nothing there but open land and the pale line of sky. By the third day, the well held enough water to draw twice without scraping bottom. The fence stood straight along the east side, and every time Clara turned her head just a second too late, she thought she caught a shadow where there shouldn't be one. She started working earlier. Before the sun cleared the ridge, she mended what she could see, fixed what she could reach, left the rest alone, waiting. Late afternoon, she saw him. Not close, just a figure moving along the far edge of her land, near where the trail dipped out of sight. Hat low, shoulders broad enough to catch the light even at that distance. Gideon Hale. He carried something in one hand. A coil, maybe. Rope or wire. Hard to tell from where she stood. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped forward. "Hey!" Her voice carried farther than she expected. He stopped. Didn't turn right away. Just stood there, like he'd heard her and was deciding what to do with it. Clara took another step. "You don't get to just—" She stopped herself, breath catching a little. "You don't get to leave things and walk off like it ain't your concern." Gideon turned then, slow, no hurry. From where he stood, she couldn't see his eyes under the brim of his hat. Only the line of his jaw, still unreadable. He didn't speak. Clara felt the words she'd been holding rise up, then stall. The distance between them stretched wider than it was. She pointed toward the well, the fence, the sack by the post. "I didn't ask for that." No answer. The wind shifted, pushing a strand of her hair loose across her face. She tucked it back, not breaking her stare. "If there's a price to it," she said, voice quieter now, steadier. "You say it plain." Gideon stood a moment longer. Then he set the coil in his hand down by his boot. Not on her land. Just at the edge. He gave a small shake of his head. Once, no. That was all. Clara watched him turn away again, the same way he had at the auction. Like the space behind him didn't matter. He walked until the trail took him out of sight. The coil stayed where he'd left it. Clara didn't move for a long time. Then she walked over, picked it up, and carried it back inside. That night, she placed a few bills on the corner of her table. Money she'd saved, little by little. The next morning, she took it into town. Martha Quinn's place smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Clara stepped in, boots leaving a thin line of dust across the floor. A few men sat at the tables, voices low, cards laid out between them. Martha stood behind the counter, wiping a cup dry with a cloth. She looked up once, then again, taking Clara in without comment. Clara set the folded money on the counter. "For him," she said. Martha's eyes flicked to the bills, then back to Clara. "Who?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The door opened behind her with a slow creak. Heavy steps crossed the floor. Clara didn't turn. The air shifted just enough to tell her he was there. She pushed the money forward. Debt's a debt. A hand reached past her, broad, steady, not touching her, not close enough to brush, just enough to slide the money back across the wood. It stopped against her fingers. Clara looked down at it. Then, slowly, she turned. Gideon stood there, hat still low, expression unchanged. He didn't speak, didn't even look at the money now. He stepped back once, giving the space back to her, and walked out the way he came. The door swung shut behind him. Martha set the cup down. Clara stayed where she was, the money still under her hand. Around her, the quiet returned, but not the same as before. Clara gathered the bills, folded them once, and slipped them back into her pocket. When she stepped outside, the sun sat high over Dustfall Creek. A couple of men near the hitching post glanced her way, then looked off again, like they'd seen enough. One of them leaned closer to the other, voice just low enough to carry. "Man don't work for free," he said. "Not unless he's planning to collect." Clara paused. Just a second, then kept walking, back toward the road, back toward the land that now felt watched. Not by the town, not by the men who whispered, but by the one who never said a word. The next morning came with a dry wind that carried dust low across the valley. Clara was already outside when the light touched the ridge. She had a hammer in hand, sleeves rolled, a strip of cloth wrapped around her palm where the wire had cut her the day before. She didn't look toward the trail, not once. She worked the west fence now, driving nails into a post that leaned just enough to remind her it might give if she didn't set it right. Each strike rang out sharp in the quiet. Steady, measured. Halfway through the line, she stopped. Hoofbeats. Not one horse. Several. Clara straightened, wiping her hand against her skirt. 3 riders came down the slope. Not fast, not slow. Like they already knew where they were headed. The man in front sat easy in his saddle, coat clean, hat set just right. He didn't look around as he rode in. He didn't need to. Silas Brogan. He drew up near the gate, but didn't dismount. His eyes moved once over the land, the fence, the well, the small patch of cleared ground. Then he looked at Clara. "You've been busy," he said. Clara rested the hammer against the post, one hand still on it. "It's my land." Silas nodded once, like he agreed with something that didn't matter much to him. He gestured lightly to the men behind him. "Could be easier," he said. "Sell it. Take a fair price. I've got work at the main ranch. House, too. You wouldn't be out here alone." Clara held his gaze. The wind pushed at the edge of her coat, lifting it just enough to show the worn seam along the side. "I didn't come out here for easier," she said. Silas studied her a moment longer. Then he gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Suit yourself." He turned his horse without another word. The other 2 followed, their mounts stepping careful around the fence line before heading back the way they came. Clara watched them go until the ridge swallowed them up. Then she picked the hammer back up and kept working. The trouble came before noon the next day. Clara heard it before she saw it. A rush of movement. Hooves striking hard, fast, out of rhythm. She turned just as 2 of her horses broke past the corral, reins trailing, eyes wide. The gate hung open behind them, one hinge torn loose, wood splintered where it had been forced. "Hey!" She ran forward, grabbing for a rope as the animals scattered. One cut left toward the low ground. The other bolted straight across the field, kicking up dust that stung her eyes. Clara caught the rope and swung it wide, missing once, twice. On the 3rd try, it settled around the nearer horse's neck. She pulled, boots digging into the dirt, breath tight in her chest until the animal slowed, then stopped. By the time she tied it off, the other horse was gone past the far fence. Clara stood there a moment, chest rising and falling, then turned back toward the corral. The gate hadn't just come loose. The rope had been cut clean through. She knelt, picking up the frayed end. The fibers were sharp, not worn, fresh. Her eyes moved across the ground. Tracks. Too many to be hers, too heavy to be just the horses. They led away from the corral, cutting across the hard dirt toward the ridge, toward the trail that ran near Gideon's land. Clara straightened slowly. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint echo of voices from the direction of town. It didn't take long. By afternoon, they came. Men from Dustfall Creek. A few she knew by name. A few she didn't. They didn't gather in a tight line. Didn't crowd her fence, just spread out enough to see. To be seen. Sheriff Boone rode in last, hat low, eyes moving from the broken gate to the scattered tracks. No one said it. They didn't have to. Every glance moved the same way. Past Clara, toward the ridge, toward Gideon. Clara stood with her hand on the corral post, the cut rope still in her fingers. "You got something to say," she said, not raising her voice. "You say it." Silence. One of the men shifted, stepping forward just enough to break from the others. "Tracks lead that way," he muttered, nodding toward the trail. Sheriff Boone didn't answer right away. He looked at the ground again, at the marks in the dirt. Then he turned his horse. "Let's go see," he said. Clara didn't wait to be told. She dropped the rope and followed. Gideon stood in his yard when they reached him. Same as always, same place, like he hadn't moved since the last time anyone had seen him. The men spread out again, not too close, not too far. The sheriff rode forward. "Got some trouble down the ridge," he said. Gideon didn't answer. He looked past them instead, eyes settling on Clara where she stood near the back. Just for a second. Then he looked away. The man who had stepped forward earlier moved again, pointing back the way they'd come. "Her horses. Gate's been cut. Tracks come straight through here." Gideon's gaze dropped to the ground at his feet, then lifted. He said nothing. Another step forward. Another man, hand resting on the butt of his gun, not drawing it, just making sure it was known. "You got anything to say for yourself?" Gideon walked to the edge of his yard. Slow, measured. He placed one hand on the wooden gate that marked his boundary. The wood groaned under the weight. Not breaking, not even close. Just enough to sound like it might. The man stopped where he was. No one else moved. Clara stood there, the space between them all stretching tight. The sheriff glanced once at her, then back at Gideon. "Did you go down there last night?" he asked. Gideon didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't shake his head. Just stood there. Clara felt it then, the pull of it, the rope, the tracks, the silence, everything pointing one way. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood between the two sides, between the men and the man they were waiting on. No speech, no claim. Just there. Not moving, not stepping back. The wind moved through the yard, lifting dust in small spirals around their boots. No one reached for a weapon. No one needed to. The moment held on its own. Sheriff Boone let out a slow breath. "Enough for now," he said. The tension didn't break. It eased. Just a little. The men stepped back one by one, not taking their eyes off Gideon. Clara stayed where she was a moment longer. Then she turned, walked back down the trail without looking behind her. The dust settled again, but nothing felt the same. By sundown, the talk had already circled back to town. Clara could feel it in the way people didn't look at her when she walked past the hitching posts, in the way the door at Martha Quinn's place went quiet a second too long when she stepped inside for flour and a small sack of beans. No one said Gideon's name out loud. They didn't need to. Sheriff Boone rode out the next morning. Clara watched from the edge of her fence as he headed up the trail, one hand resting easy on the reins, the other low by his side. He didn't look her way. He came back alone. By noon, word reached her without anyone meaning to carry it. Gideon had been told to leave for a spell. "Just until things cool," someone said near the water trough. Clara stood still when she heard it. The bucket in her hand dipped lower than it should have, water sloshing over the side and darkening the dirt at her feet. She set it down slow. Didn't ask how long. Didn't ask where he went. There wasn't anyone to answer that anyway. The land grew quiet in a different way after that. Not empty, just without something she hadn't realized she'd been listening for. Clara worked through it. She fixed the gate as best she could, replacing the hinge with one from the shed door. It didn't sit straight, but it held. She walked the fence line again, tightening what she could, leaving the rest marked in her mind for later. The missing horse came back on the third day, lathered and skittish, reins tangled in brush. She found it near the creek bed and led it home without speaking. No one came to help, no one came to ask. That was easier in its own way. Late one afternoon, she went into the shed to sort what tools she had left. The light came in low through a gap in the wall, laying a pale strip across the floor. She moved a crate aside. Something slid loose behind it. Clara crouched, pulling it out. A folded piece of paper. Thick, edges worn. She opened it slow. Lines crossed the page in careful strokes. Not random, measured. Sections marked off in small squares. A path drawn from the well toward the lower ground. Another line splitting the back field into two even strips. Notes in the margin. Short. Practical. Water holds here. Fence line. Shift 2 feet west. Grass takes better shade on this side. At the bottom corner, a name. Not his. Hers. Clara Reed. The ink had faded just enough to tell it hadn't been written yesterday. She sat back on her heels, the paper resting in her hands. The wind pushed against the shed wall, making the boards creak. Dust lifted in the beam of light and drifted slow. He hadn't just patched things. He'd seen them. All of it. Before she ever asked. Clara folded the paper once, then again. Careful this time. She tucked it into her coat. That night came colder. She sat at the table, with the lamp burning low, the paper laid out flat beside her. Her finger traced the lines without touching them, stopping where the well met the drawn path. In the quiet, she heard something outside. Soft. Not hoofbeats. A shuffle. Light. Clara stood, stepping out onto the porch. A boy stood near the fence, hat too big for his head, shifting from one foot to the other. Eli Carter. He didn't step closer. "Miss Reed," he said, voice low. Clara waited. He glanced back toward the trail, then at the ground. "I seen something," he muttered. She didn't move. "Night before your horses ran," he went on, words coming quicker now, like he didn't want to lose them. "I was cutting through the ridge. Saw 2 men down by your corral, not him." Clara's hand rested against the doorframe. "Who?" Eli shook his head. "Didn't get close enough. But one of them had Brogan's mark on his saddle. I seen it before." The wind lifted, carrying the smell of dry grass between them. Clara looked past the boy, out toward the dark line of the ridge. "Why tell me now?" she asked. Eli shrugged, small. "Didn't think it was my place." A pause. "Still ain't," he added. Clara studied him a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. "That's fine," she said. He tipped his hat once and backed away, turning quick before heading down the path. Clara stayed there until he was gone. The next morning, she didn't ride into town, didn't go looking for the sheriff, didn't ask for anything. She rolled up her sleeves and carried the paper out into the yard. set it on the fence post, looked at the land the way it was drawn. Then she picked up a shovel. The ground was hard where the path was marked. It took time to break it. Each strike rang dull through the handle, up into her arms. She kept going, one line at a time. By midday, a shallow trench cut through the dirt, leading from the well toward the lower field. Clara paused, leaning on the shovel, catching her breath. She glanced once toward the ridge. Nothing there. Just open land. She went back to work. By evening, water began to move. Not much. Just a slow trickle following the line she'd carved. But it moved. Clara stood at the end of it, watching as it spread thin across the dry ground, darkening it in uneven patches. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just watched. The wind eased for a moment, and in that quiet, the land didn't feel as empty as it had the day before. Not because he was there, but because something he had started hadn't left with him. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and picked the paper back up. This time, she didn't fold it away right off. She held it a second longer, then turned back toward the house. Work to finish, plenty of it. And for the first time since the auction, she didn't feel like she was standing alone against it. Morning came quiet over Dustfall Creek. Clara was already out by the trench, boots damp where the water had started to settle into the soil. The line she'd cut held, not deep, not wide, but enough to carry something forward. She nudged a clump of dirt aside with her boot and watched the thin stream find its path again. It was working. Not perfect, not easy, but working. She leaned the shovel against the fence and straightened, pressing a hand against the small of her back. The wind had softened overnight. The air felt different, like it had made room for something. From the ridge, a rider came into view, slow, alone. Clara didn't move. She knew the shape of that figure before it came close enough to see clearly. The way he sat his horse, the way the horse didn't pull against the reins. Gideon Hale. He didn't ride into the yard. He stopped at the edge of it, just beyond the fence line, the same place he'd always stayed, like there was a line he wasn't meant to cross. Clara wiped her hands once against her skirt and walked toward him. Not fast, not careful, just steady. She stopped a few feet from the fence. Neither of them spoke. The water ran behind her, soft against the dirt. Gideon's eyes moved once across the land, the fence, the trench, the way the ground had darkened where the water reached. Then they settled on her. Clara held his gaze. "You were right," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. He didn't answer, didn't nod, just stood there. Clara reached into her coat and pulled the folded paper free. She walked to the fence and set it on the top rail between them. It didn't flutter. The air is still. "I found it," she said. Gideon looked at the paper, didn't touch it. Clara stepped back once, giving it space. "I thought you were setting me up," she went on, not looking away from him. "Figured you'd come back for it when I couldn't hold it together." A pause. "I was wrong." The words sat there. Gideon's hand rested loose against the saddle horn. His fingers shifted once. That was all. From down the road, another rider approached, then two more. Sheriff Boone came into the yard this time. He didn't stop at the fence. He rode straight through, dismounted, and let the reins hang loose. "Got something settled," he said, voice carrying enough to reach both of them. Clara turned slightly, but didn't step away from where she stood. "Man from Brogan's place came in this morning," the sheriff went on. "Couldn't keep his story straight. Finally told it plain." He glanced once toward the ridge, then back at Clara. Gate was cut on orders. Horses turned loose to make it look like something else. Silence. The kind that didn't ask for more. Clara looked at the ground for a second, then back up. "And Brogan?" she asked. "Packing up some of his claims," Boone said, not saying much else. That was enough. The sheriff tipped his hat once, turned, and led his horse back toward the road. The others followed. Dust rose behind them, then settled. Clara stood there with the truth sitting quiet in the air. No apology, no speech, just clear. She turned back to Gideon. He hadn't moved. The paper still rested between them on the fence. Clara stepped forward again, closer this time. "If you're waiting to be asked," she said, "don't." He looked at her, really looked this time. She tapped the paper once with her fingers. "You saw this land before I did," she went on. "Laid it out. Fixed what you could." A small breath. "But you stayed out of it." Gideon's jaw shifted. Barely. Clara held his gaze. "If you're not planning on taking it," she said, her voice softer now, but steady, "then don't stand outside it." The wind picked up just enough to move a strand of her hair across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Gideon looked down at the paper, at the lines he'd drawn, then at the trench behind her, the water moving through it. Not his work. Not anymore. His hand left the saddle horn. Slow. He swung down from the horse, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. The space between them changed. Not smaller. Just different. Gideon stepped to the fence, reached out. Not for her. For the paper. He picked it up, unfolded it once, then set it back down where it had been. His hand stayed there a second longer than it needed to. Then he moved to the gate, the one she'd fixed. The hinge creaked when he pushed it open. Not smooth, not clean, but it held. He stepped through, didn't look back. Clara watched him cross into the yard, the same way he had crossed into that auction space days before. No announcement, no claim, just a step taken. She turned and walked beside him, not ahead, not behind. The water kept moving through the trench, catching light as it spread. Behind them, the gate swung once, then settled into place. Two sets of footprints marked the damp ground, side by side. Dustfall Creek carried on the way it always did. Voices, wagons, deals made and forgotten. But out past the ridge on a narrow stretch of land that most folks had already written off, something held. Not taken, not given. Kept. Out there, past the noise of Dustfall Creek, nothing looked different at first glance. The same wind, the same dry earth, the same long stretch of sky that never promised much. But if you stood long enough, you'd notice it. Water moving where there hadn't been any. A fence line holding straight through the wind. Two people walking the same ground without stepping around each other. Gideon never tried to claim what wasn't his. That's what made people uneasy about him. A man that strong, choosing not to take. Choosing to stay outside until he was invited in. And Clara, she never handed her life over, even when it would have been easier. She held her ground when no one stood with her. And when the truth came, she didn't run after it. She built something from it. That's the thing about real treasure. It isn't what you protect with force. It's what you stand beside, even when no one's watching. So if you found yourself in her place, would you trust the man who says nothing, or the crowd that always has something to say? If this story stayed with you, you might find others here that do the same. Quiet ones. The kind that take their time, but leave something behind.